Today we will talk about 3 incredible close calls that happened in war, which no one would believe occurred if they weren't confirmed by evidence or witnesses. Get ready for true, scary, and terrifyingly close call stories that defy reality. Number 1. Norman Sirel Jackson. Jackson was a Royal Air Force flight engineer serving on an Avro Lancaster bomber during the Second World War. He had completed his tour of 30 missions in 1944, but because one of these missions was with another crew, he wanted to fly one more so his original crew would finish their tour together. And it was during this mission that everything went horrifically wrong, and Jackson would do something no one could have ever imagined. On the night of April 26th, after bombing the target, Jackson's Lancaster quickly turned around and headed back to base. However, they were soon attacked by a German night fighter, which sprayed them with multiple bursts of bullets. Jackson was wounded in the leg early on, and a fire started near the fuel tank between the fuselage and the inner engine. Realizing that the fire was spreading dangerously fast towards the fuel tank, Jackson had an idea. He took a fire extinguisher, tucked it into the top of his life jacket, strapped on a parachute, and through the escape hatch above the pilot, climbed out to try to put the fire out. However, traveling at 20,000 feet at 140 miles per hour, while still under attack by the German fighter, made this task nearly impossible. But things were about to get even crazier. Before he could fully climb out, his parachute pack opened and the canopy and rigging lines spilled out everywhere. Jackson continued his plan, climbing along the exterior of the aircraft towards the fire, battling the air resistance. He managed to pull out the fire extinguisher, but he slipped and nearly fell completely off the plane, holding on to the air intake beneath the wing. The fire spread, and now the flames were blowing directly into his face and hands. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the German fighter made another attack, firing a burst that almost killed Jackson and swept him off the plane. He fell from 20,000 feet with a parachute that was only partially open and burning. His crew saw him for the last time falling at great speed, engulfed in flames. The crew then abandoned the Lancaster, and except for the air gunner and pilot who were killed, the rest of the crew landed safely and were captured by the Germans. As for Jackson, his story wasn't over yet. He landed hard, breaking his ankle on top of the wounds and burns he had sustained on the plane. He was semi-conscious during the night, with his eyes swollen shut and his hands useless due to the burns. But in the morning, he managed to crawl to the nearest village where he was captured by the Germans. He spent 10 months recovering in the hospital before being transferred to a prisoner of war camp, from which he attempted 2 escapes. In the second escape, he managed to make contact with a unit of the United States Third Army. The surviving crew members confirmed this incredible story, and Jackson was awarded the Victoria Cross after the war for his insane bravery in trying to save his crew and bomber. Number 2. Jan Balsrud. Norwegian commando Jan Balsrud was part of an 11-man team that embarked on a critical covert mission during the Second World War known as Operation Martin. However, the commandos had no idea that everything that could go wrong would go far worse than they could have ever imagined. On a small fishing boat carrying 8 tons of explosives, they slipped unnoticed into Nazi-occupied Norway, intending to blow up a German airfield tower and make contact with the resistance movement. When they found their contact, a critical mistake occurred that would turn this story into complete horror. The shopkeeper, who was their contact, had been replaced by a man with the same name to whom the commandos revealed their plan and intentions. This man, fearing it was a Gestapo test, reported the situation to the authorities. The commandos' boat was later intercepted and fiercely attacked by a German patrol boat, the Raumboot R-56. In the chaos, the commandos set a time fuse on the explosives and tried to escape on a smaller, faster boat using the explosion as cover. Unfortunately, their plan failed and the boat was soon sunk, leaving the commandos swimming in freezing cold Arctic waters. The commandos were then either shot or worse, picked up and captured by the Gestapo. Knowing that imprisonment by the Gestapo only meant torture and then death, Jan and one other commando somehow swam to shore and began running through the snow. Jan had already been shot in the foot, and in the next shot, his fellow commander was shot in the back of the head. Jan was left alone, soaking wet in freezing temperatures, wounded, and with a large Nazi force close behind him. From here, things would go from bad to unbelievably worse. He hid behind a rock, armed only with a pistol. He waited for the Germans to come closer, seeing only one reasonable option: to die in a firefight to avoid capture. As they approached, he stood up, aimed and pulled the trigger. To his horror, nothing happened. He pulled out the magazine, removed the first 2 bullets, reloaded and aimed again. He fired, killing one German and wounding another. To his astonishment, the Germans, unexpecting this bold move, turned and fled. Jan used this chance to keep running, missing one boot and part of his foot, into the wilderness. What this man would endure for the next 3 months defies reality and can only be described as pure hell. In his frantic escape, he ran as far as he could until he began freezing and fainting from exhaustion. He stumbled upon a small family home, and after terrifying them with his appearance, he explained who he was and what was happening. Despite knowing the risks of helping a fugitive, the family helped him, as did many other Norwegians over the next 3 months. However, that didn't mean things would go smoothly in the brutal Norwegian winter. Quite the opposite. His wounded feet worsened and froze solid, threatening gangrene. On top of that, he suffered from malnutrition and snow blindness. He was traveling painfully slowly toward the border of neutral Sweden, but his condition worsened by the day. There were close calls with German patrols, and then an avalanche buried him up to his neck, freezing his eyelids shut. He was on the brink of death, completely blind and hallucinating, when he was saved by another family. When he recovered slightly, he was transferred to a small, isolated and freezing hut, which he called Hotel Savoy. Here he had to do something horrific to himself. To prevent infection from his frostbitten toes, he used a pocket knife to amputate his big toe on one foot and part of the other foot, all by himself and with nothing else but the pocket knife. Sadly, this wasn't the last time he had to do that. His next attempt at evacuation again went wrong and had to be postponed, leaving Jan alone and isolated for 27 days. Fighting starvation and infection, he amputated the rest of his toes by himself, clinging to life, waiting and hoping. Eventually, Norwegian rescuers came, took him to the Finnish border, where he was saved. When he was rescued, he weighed only 80 pounds, but the story doesn't end here. After months of recovery, Jan returned to active duty to get his revenge. The Gestapo officers who executed his team were found after the war and forced to dig up the graves of the team with their bare hands and give them proper burial. Then they were tried and executed by the Norwegian government. Jan went on to live a long life with his family after the war, closing one of the most terrifying yet true stories. Number 3. Nicholas Alcemade. Nicholas Alcemade, a 21-year-old tail gunner in the Royal Air Force, was flying back from a bombing raid over Berlin on the night of March 24, 1944, when his Avro Lancaster bomber was heavily damaged by a German night fighter. The aircraft burst into flames and began to spiral out of control, plummeting towards the ground from an altitude of 18,000 feet. As Nicholas prepared to bail out, he realized his parachute had caught fire and was useless. Faced with the choice of burning alive or jumping to his death, Nicholas quickly made a decision. He jumped from the doomed bomber without a parachute, preferring to die upon impact. Amazingly, Nicholas's fall was broken by a forest of pine trees and a thick blanket of snow. Against all odds, he survived the 18,000-foot plunge with nothing more than a sprained leg and bruises. When German forces captured him, they were skeptical of his story at first. But after examining the wreckage and finding his charred parachute, just as he had described, the Gestapo gave him a certificate verifying the impossible event that had happened. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner before being repatriated in 1945. If you want to hear more stories like this, let us know in the comments.